I would like to welcome all of you to Brookings this afternoon. And I also want to especially thank those of you who couldn't join us in person but have decided to tune in through the webcast. We have a really compact and rich discussion for you this afternoon about the future of Detroit. And I want to stress the word future because Detroit has weathered a lot in its past. Deindustrialization, some mass outmigration, a great recession that led to a number of foreclosures and a collapse of the auto industry, bankruptcy. In fact, because all this, former HUD Secretary Henry Cisneros called it about as close a time as any in which the U.S. almost lost a city. The good news is we didn't let that happen. In fact, Detroit may be a harbinger of what is to come, an economic and community revival driven by solutions mostly outside of government. And our program today features these leaders, philanthropic, business, civic, nonprofit, leaders who chose to not give up on the people, the industries, and the rich culture of Detroit. And their efforts are paying off, and we are seeing stories everywhere about what we are calling today hashtag Detroit resurgence. You know, there was a Washington Post story titled, "For Downtrodden Detroit, Hopes of Revitalization," which was around the Woodward Corridor. There was a New York Times columnist about the spirit and promise of Detroit. And in addition to those stories, the market momentum is also real. You know, Brookings' latest Metro Monitor found that since 2009, the Detroit metro economy is expanding in such a way that Metro Detroit ranks 8th among all metros in the growth of its productivity in its industries, and it ranks number 1 among metros in the share of workers, or the growth in the share of workers who are now employed. In fact, the share of workers with jobs have increased for both whites and workers of colors in this community. So even though there's a lot more work to be done, there is tangible progress in Detroit's ongoing journey. Now, to help us map what's next for Detroit, we have a 2-part program for you this afternoon. First, Rip Rapson, the president of the Kresge Foundation, will unveil a new survey that they are releasing today, the Detroit Reinvestment Index. That index is going to set up a conversation that Rip will moderate among 4 panelists who are well steeped in the actions in the city. Now, I'm going to go ahead and introduce some of those panelists now so that we can have a seamless conversation once Rip presents the index findings. We have with us today Sandy Barua, who is the president and CEO of the Detroit Regional Chamber of Commerce and a former director of the U.S. Small Business Administration and the U.S. EDA under President Bush. Stephen Henderson is here with us today. He is the editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press, and he's also won a number of awards, including the Pulitzer Prize for Commentary in 2014. And in fact, that same year, he was chosen by his peers to receive the Journalist of the Year award from, the National Association of Black Journalists. Quentin Primo is with us this afternoon. He is the chairman and CEO of Capri Investment Group, which is a global real estate investment and management group that is in the middle of right now raising $200 million fund for what they're calling the Detroit Urban Investment Fund. And we're going to learn more about that this afternoon. And last but not least is Jennifer Vey, who is a longtime colleague of ours at Brookings, and she now co-directs the Bass Initiative on Innovation and Placemaking, an evidence-driven effort to pioneer innovation districts in the U.S. and in Europe, including in Midtown and downtown Detroit. Now, there will be time for all of you to ask questions to both Rip and the panelists, so please Keep those in mind, including for those of you who are on the webcast. If you're interested in asking questions, please use, again, the hashtag Detroit Resurgence and pose your questions there, and we will be monitoring it over the next hour and a half. I am now going to hand the mic off to my friend and colleague, Rip Rapson, who is going to run the program from here. But before I do, I want to give him a proper introduction. And if any of you have ever been in a meeting with Rip, he has this amazing way of giving sort of a personal touch to the way he introduces people and participants in his room. So what I wanted to say is, not only are we grateful to Rip and the Kresge Foundation for nearly a decade of support and collaboration to our program at Brookings, but he has been a source of inspiration for all of us, dating back to his leadership in Minneapolis. And there's no doubt he has retained his Minnesota nice, as he has been dogged with his Midwest grit. And he clearly has shown that in Detroit, not settling for anything less than bold and humane. His tireless commitment to Detroit is evident through Kresge's leadership in everything from transit investments to housing and vacant land reform to small business and entrepreneurship and early childhood education. You know, a few months ago, the Detroit News article called Rip, quote, a visionary. And I agree. So please join me in welcoming Rip Rapson.
Thank you, Amy. That was incredibly nice. And so I have nothing else to say. Thank you. But I do want to thank you and your staff for putting together what we never imagined would be a standing room audience. We deeply appreciate that. This is why we appreciate your staff so much. Thank you. Thank you. But I also just want to return the compliment. It's hard to imagine an institution that has been formative to every important conversation about urban America over the last 20 years. And I've known Amy almost that long, and she has had an indelible tracing effect on, I think, virtually all of the the issues we're going to talk about this afternoon, from economic development to land use to real estate reinvestment and on and on. So we're just delighted to be here, and we're honored to be among so many friends. I see a lot of folks in the audience who actually could be on the panel as well, and so I hope we'll draw you in during the conversation. I want to just, I'm sorry for this, but I want to very quickly thank my team, which is quite an extraordinary team, and we've got hundreds of them here. We've got Jennifer Kolzicki and Christine Jacobs from our communications office, R.A. Simon, who's our vice president of programs and chief strategy officer, Aaron Patton, who's affiliated with our executive office, and my old tennis doubles partner, Alan Stone, who I just thought I should bring along because my forehand is really pathetic these days. I also wanted to thank Raul Bafnani of FTI Consulting and his team. They were the ones who fielded the survey of the hundreds of business folks that we're going to talk about over the next couple of moments. Let me say that Kresge's deep commitment to Detroit began very soon after our namesake built his first five and dime store there in 1899. Although we are a national foundation, our core identity has always been tied to Detroit, and proudly so. This is in part why Detroit's resurgence means so much to us, particularly given that we... Alan. Yeah, I think it's, yeah. That'll teach me to talk about tennis in a major national conversation. But this is in part why Detroit's resurgence means so much to us, particularly given that we were able to play a central role in resolving Detroit's historic bankruptcy with an historic solution, the Grand Bargain. And we're now playing a critical role in designing the strategies and forging the partnerships needed to sustain Detroit's renaissance. You know, at events like the one today, I'm often asked a whole suite of questions having to do with how philanthropy helped save a city that was swamped by the tsunami of seemingly intractable problems that Detroit faced. how solving problems in Detroit might provide hints for addressing the huge challenges that other cities face, and how we might best ensure that this recovery remains robust and inclusive and sustainable for our children and beyond. And that's really why we've structured the panel we have today. I think we want to pivot from the findings of the poll to exactly those sorts of questions. But let me help build a surround for that conversation by laying out the fascinating findings of our first Detroit Reinvestment Index that Amy spoke about, which can be found at kresge.org/reinvest, where you can find the comprehensive data set and additional analysis. It's important to note at the outset that the engagement of business with Detroit has been pervasive and profound since at least 1820. People sometimes forget that the reason Henry Ford picked Detroit was because its economy at that time was not in 1820, but a little bit later, was as strong and diverse as anywhere in the nation. We gathered this snapshot in time, pulling data in that spirit. We see the poll as having a number of purposes. It takes stock of public perceptions surrounding Detroit, particularly in its post-bankruptcy phase. It creates a benchmarking tool to understand the impact of public-private revitalization efforts to date and in the future. It seeks to capture lessons of what's worked and what hasn't worked in Detroit and share those key findings with others engaged in reinvigorating urban communities. And it attempts to determine how national business leaders, a critical component of Detroit's rebound, see the city today. So with caveats I'm going to go into in a bit, I think it's fair to say that business is very bullish on Detroit. Here's why I say that. First, nearly 3/4 of the business leaders we polled believe Detroit is a good place to invest. 3/4. Second, the top characteristic they use to describe Detroit is a city in economic recovery. Third, nearly 85% are confident that Detroit can become a great city again. And that number goes up to 95% if you just count the top CEOs we surveyed. And fourth, going even further, almost 100% believe that all cities are capable of overcoming the most serious of challenges, an optimism about cities that gives so many of us in this room great hope. What makes these positive findings even more remarkable is that we also learned that only 16% of business leaders outside of Detroit were aware that the city has actually emerged from bankruptcy. Newsflash to America, we have. And we accomplished that consensually and at warp speed. One can only assume that once that fact is more widely absorbed by the public, the findings will be even more positive. As it is, results like these will help continue the change narrative about Detroit. I strongly believe that investment comes to a place that possesses a sense of optimism, and the Detroit of today embodies that sense of possibility. After seeing these initial overall findings, we wanted to dig a little deeper into the data and tease out not just the fact that business leaders are bullish about Detroit, but why. I don't think we found, or actually we could find, direct causality between these findings and the feelings behind them, but I think we found some very suggestive possibilities. First, an enormous percentage of business people have a connection to Detroit. Almost 50% of the business leaders we question have or have had business operations or have made investments in Detroit. And between visiting Detroit for business or pleasure and having families or friends in the area, more than 90% of business leaders we polled have some relationship with Detroit. Second, they like what they're hearing about the city. We asked everyone to evaluate their general impressions of Detroit from all they've read or heard lately. 2/3 said that their impressions of Detroit had become more favorable recently. Among many conclusions one could draw from this is that although they don't necessarily know precisely that Detroit has emerged from bankruptcy, they do know that the news is better than it might have been or better than they might have expected. Third, the essential identity of Detroit is real to business leaders. When given a list of the various characteristics that people value in cities, Detroit was rated highest by nearly 75% of business leaders for having a rich cultural history and for being ethnically and racially diverse and vibrant. In other words, business leaders get Detroit. Regardless of the city's recent struggles, what Detroit is and what it stands for remain a powerful presence in their lives, and that's great news. But we also have to be honest about and acknowledge that there are serious concerns that the poll raises as well. For example, we probed the business leaders on what they look for when measuring the health of communities, the strength of the economy, and the likelihood of getting ahead in a city. It turns out that the feature they are most looking for in almost every instance is a low crime rate, and there Detroit falls short. 80% believe that a low crime rate is essential for success, but only 52% rate Detroit as excellent or good on that dimension. Similarly, there remains a significant gap between the importance business leaders place on the role of an effective local government and the creation of a sound municipal budget and what they perceive Detroit's performance to be for each. Now, obviously, these are sobering findings, but they're not unexpected. The city has made considerable progress in multiple measures of safety and is once again in the hands of responsive and competent municipal government. Yet, we continue to work in the shadow of a long period of political dysfunction and corroded municipal services. So at the same time we take satisfaction in the very good news in this survey, we recognize that we have to be clear-eyed about the challenges it spells out and the need to take them head-on as we move forward. As I mentioned earlier, these data are a part of a larger effort Kresge is undertaking to share lessons with other cities across the country about what we've learned from our experiences in our hometown. Those lessons are tied to a handful of building blocks that Detroit has put in place over the last 7 years to spur its resurgence. We'll talk about these again in the panel in just a moment, but let me just provide the quickest of flyovers. We've recalibrated the roles and responsibilities of the public, private, nonprofit, and philanthropic sectors, creating a model of distributive leadership that optimizes what each of those sectors does best and elevates the importance of partnerships among them. We've invested in the residential and commercial vitality of downtown and along Woodward Avenue, creating the preconditions for the market to return to Detroit. We've developed a land use framework to power planning and investment decisions to convert the city's vast swaths of blighted land into productive uses such as green-blue infrastructure, reclamation of abandoned homes for community purposes, public spaces and reforestation, and urban farming. We've begun channeling greater investments into Detroit's neighborhoods, animating our land use strategies through expansive blight remediation efforts, innovative support for home mortgages, targeted commercial corridor development, and innovative reuse of abandoned and vacant land. We've created a sophisticated and effective entrepreneurial and small business development infrastructure that has created a flywheel of small business formation, from restaurants to startups, from arts and cultural centers to barbershops and bakeries. And we've taken the first step toward creating a comprehensive and equitable public transportation system through our investment in the M1 light rail line that will run along Woodward and open next year, and many others. So I believe that the forces propelling the rebirth of Detroit over these last 7 years were crystallized in the resolution of Detroit's bankruptcy, when the very unlikely mix of foundations and unions, a museum, and municipal and state government came together to pull Detroit through an existential crisis that could have catapulted a once great city into a decade-long spiral of litigation, investor uncertainty, and government paralysis. The rapid and consensual resolution of that crisis was a precondition to all else. It put us in the starting blocks, and it began erasing what had heretofore been indelible images of entropy and apocalypse too long associated with Detroit. These poll results suggest that we have every reason to believe that we can move out of those starting blocks and begin what is in part sprint, but mostly a marathon. Certainly, the citizens of Detroit believe that we have taken the initial, vitally important steps in that direction. It's uplifting to see that business leaders across America believe it as well and appear at the ready to embrace Detroit's new arc of aspiration. So with that framing, let me ask our panelists to come on up, and we'll try to get into the nuts and the bolts of what all of this means. Come on up, y'all.